John Rawls, 1921 to 2002, most of Americans never signed a social contract. In fact, the only people in the United States who have actually agreed to abide by the Constitution, public officials aside, are naturalized citizens, immigrants who have taken an oath of allegiance as a condition of their citizenship. The rest of us are never required or even asked to give our consent. Why are we obliged to obey the law then? And how can we say that our government rests on the consent of the governed? John Locke seems to think that we have been given tacit consent. Anyone who enjoys the benefits of a government, even by traveling on the road, implicitly consents to the law and is bound by it. It is hard to see, however, how passing through a town is morally akin to ratifying the Constitution. John Rawls, in A Theory of Justice, published in 1971, argues that the way to think about justice is to ask what principles we would agree to in an initial situation of equality. Suppose that we gathered in this hypothetical thought experiment to choose the principles to govern our collective life, to write a social contract. What principles would we choose? We would probably find it very difficult to agree. Different people would favor different principles reflecting their various interests, their moral and religious beliefs, their social positions, etc. We might settle on a compromise, but there's no reason to assume that a social contract would be a just arrangement. Now consider a thought experiment. Suppose that when we gather to choose the principles, we don't know where we will be in society. Imagine that we choose behind a veil of ignorance that temporarily prevents us from knowing anything about who in particular we are or who are we going to be. We don't know our class or gender. We don't know where we will be born. We don't know at what time we will be born. We don't know our ethnicity, our political opinions, or convictions. Nor do we know our advantages and disadvantages, whether we are healthy or not, highly educated, or a high school dropout, born to a family that is supportive, or born to a family that is extremely hurtful. So, if no one knew any of these things, we would choose in effect from an original position of equality. Since no one would have a superior position, the principles we would agree to would be just. This is Rawls' idea of the social contract. It is a hypothetical agreement in an original position of equality. Rawls invites us then to ask what principles we as rational, self-interested persons would choose if we found ourselves in that position. We would not choose utilitarianism, Rawls suggests, nor would we choose a purely laissez-faire libertarian principle. Two principles of justice would emerge, however, from the hypothetical contract. The first provides equal basic liberties for all citizens, such as freedom of speech and religion. The second principle concerns social and economic equality. So Rawls thinks these two principles would be chosen. Why does he think so, though? How can principles of justice possibly be derived from an agreement that never actually took place? Notice the moral limits of actual contracts. Actual contracts are not enough to make it fair. We need an independent standard of fairness. The constitutions are also open to the same challenge. Notice the fact that a constitution is ratified by the people, and that does not prove that its provisions are just. No actual social contract or constitutional convention, however representative it may claim to be, is actually guaranteed to produce fair terms of social cooperation. The famous words of Don Corleone in The Godfather, "I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse," suggests the pressure that hovers to some degree or another over most negotiations. Can consent, however, create an obligation on its own, or is some element of benefit or reliance also required? Well, this is a huge consideration, considering that actual contracts carry weight insofar as they realize two ideals, autonomy and reciprocity. As voluntary acts, contracts express our autonomy. The obligations they create carry weight because they are self-imposed. We take them freely upon ourselves. As instruments of mutual benefit, contracts draw on the ideal of reciprocity. The obligation to fulfill them arises from the obligation to repay others for the benefits that they provide. In practice, these ideals are imperfectly realized. Some agreements, though voluntary, are not mutually beneficial, and in some cases, consent may not be enough to create a morally binding obligation, and in others, it may not even be necessary at all. So the fact that an agreement is voluntary by no means ensures that it involves the exchange of equal or comparable benefits. Consent is not a sufficient condition of moral obligation. Consent is also not a necessary condition of moral obligation. If the mutual benefit is clear enough, the moral claims of reciprocity may hold even without an act of consent. Do not wrongly assume that wherever there is an obligation, there must have been an agreement, some act of consent. It overlooks the possibility that obligation can arise without consent. And despite our tendency to read consent into every moral claim, it is hard to make sense of our moral lives without acknowledging in independent weight reciprocity. Contracts derive their moral force from two different ideals, autonomy and reciprocity, but most actual contracts fall short of these ideals. In real life, differences in power and knowledge are always possible, and as long as this is true, the fact of an agreement does not by itself guarantee the fairness of an agreement. This is why actual contracts are not self-sufficient moral instruments. But imagine a contract among parties who were equal in power and knowledge, rather than unequal, who were identically situated, not differently situated. And imagine that the object of this contract was the principles to govern our lives together, to assign our rights and duties as citizens. A contract like this would leave no room for coercion, deception, or unfair advantages. Its terms would be just by virtue of their agreement alone. If you can imagine a contract like this, you have arrived at Rawls' idea of a hypothetical agreement in an initial situation of equality. The veil of ignorance ensures the equality of power and knowledge that the original position requires, by ensuring that no one knows his or her place in society, strengths or weaknesses, values or ends. The veil of ignorance ensures that no one can take advantage, even unwittingly, of a favorable position. What principles would emerge then? Well, we would first start, and we would want to pursue our ends and to be treated with respect. Once the veil of ignorance rises and real life begins, we do not want to find ourselves as victims of persecution or discrimination. In order to protect against these dangers, we would reject utilitarianism and agree to a principle of equal basic liberties for all citizens, including the right to liberty of conscience and freedom of thought. And we would insist that this principle take priority over attempts to maximize the general welfare. We would not sacrifice our fundamental rights and liberties for social and economic benefits. What principles, then, would we choose to govern social and economic inequalities? We might at first have thought to favor an equal distribution of income and wealth, but then it would occur to us that we could do better, even for those on the bottom. Suppose that by permitting certain inequalities on the hierarchy, such as higher pay for doctors than for bus drivers, we could improve the situation of those who have the least by increasing access to health care for the poor. Allowing for this possibility, we would adopt what Rawls calls the difference principle, which states that only those social and economic inequalities are permitted that work to the benefit of the least advantaged members of society. Exactly how egalitarian is the difference principle? Well, it is hard to say because the effect of pay differences depend on social and economic circumstances. Rawls' theory is not meant to assess the fairness of this or that person's salary, but it is concerned with the basic structure of society and the way it allocates rights and duties, income and wealth, power and opportunities. Rawls does not believe that people choosing principles to govern their fundamental life prospects would take chances. Unless they knew themselves to be lovers of risk a quality blocked from view by the veil of ignorance, people would not make risky bets at high stakes. Underlying the device of the veil of ignorance is a moral argument that can be presented independent of the thought experiment. Its main idea is that the distribution of income and opportunity should not be based on factors that are arbitrary from a moral point of view. Market societies remedy this arbitrariness, at least to some degree. They open careers to those with the requisite talents and provide equality before the law. Citizens are assured equal basic liberties, and the distribution of income and wealth is determined by the free market. This system, a free market with formal equality of opportunity, corresponds to the libertarian theory of justice. It represents an improvement over feudal and caste societies, since it rejects fixed hierarchies. Legally, though, it allows everyone to strive and to compete. In practice, however, opportunities may be far from equal. Allowing everyone to enter the race is a good thing, but if the runners start from different starting points, the race is hardly fair. That is why Rawls argues the distribution of income and wealth that results from a free market with formal equality of opportunity cannot be considered just. The distribution of income and wealth that results from a free market economy is just, but only if everyone has the same opportunity to develop his or her talents. Only if everyone begins at the same starting line can it be said that the winners of the race deserve their rewards. Consider then four rival theories of distribution justice. The first is feudal or caste system, which is a fixed hierarchy based on birth. The second is libertarian, which is a free market economy with formal equality of opportunity. The third is a meritocratic society, which is a free market with fair equality of opportunity. And the fourth is egalitarian, which is Rawls' difference principle. Rawls argues that each of the first three theories bases distributive shares on factors that are arbitrary from a moral point of view, whether accident of birth or social and economic advantage or natural talents and abilities. Only the difference principle avoids basing the distribution of income and wealth on these contingencies. In thinking about justice, however, we should refrain from using contingent facts about persons and their social positions. One objection is incentives. What about incentives? If the talented can benefit from their talents only on terms that help the least well off, what if they decide to work less or not to develop their skills in the first place? The difference principle permits income inequalities for the sake of incentives, and provided the incentives are needed to improve the lot of the least advantaged. Income inequalities are just only insofar as they call forth efforts that ultimately help the disadvantaged. Another objection could be effort. What about effort? Well, what about the hard work that people devote to cultivating their talents? Notwithstanding their talents and gifts, do they not deserve the rewards their efforts bring? The willingness to make an effort is itself dependent upon happy family and social circumstances. Like other factors in our success, effort is influenced by contingencies for which we can claim no credit. It seems clear that the effort of a person is willing to make is influenced by his or her natural abilities and skills and the alternatives open to them. The better endowed are more likely, other things equal, to strive conscientiously. Many argue that their achievements reflect their own hard work, factors beyond their control. But the claim that people deserve the rewards that come from effort and hard work is highly questionable. Whether or not our work ethic is our own doing, our contribution depends, at least in part, on natural talents for which we can claim no credit. In medieval Tuscany, for example, fresco painters were highly valued. In 21st century California, computer programmers are, and so on. Whether my skills yield a lot or a little depends on what the society happens to want. What counts as contributing depends on the qualities a given society in the history of humanity happens to prize. Consider these wage differentials. The average school teacher in the United States makes about $43,000 a year. David Letterman, the late-night talk show host on TV, earns $31 million a year. John Roberts, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, is paid $217,400 a year. Judge Judy, who has a reality television show, makes $25 million a year. Wow. Are these pay differentials fair? The answer would depend on whether they arose within a system of taxation and redistribution that works to the benefit of the least well off. If so, they would be entitled to their earnings. The fact is that they happen to live in a society that lavishes huge sums on television, and that is their good luck. It is not something that they deserve. The successful, however, often overlook this contingent aspect of their success. Many of us are fortunate to possess, in some measure or another, qualities that our society happens to prize. In a capitalist society, it helps to have entrepreneurial drive. In a bureaucratic society, it helps to get along easy with your superiors. In a mass democratic society, it helps to look good and to speak in short sound bites. In a litigious society, it helps to go to law school and to have logical and reasoning skills. That our society values these things is not our doing, however. Suppose that we, with our talents, inhabited not a technologically advanced, highly litigious society like ours, but a hunting society, or a warrior society, or a religious society for that matter. What would become of our talents? Then clearly they would not get us very far. But would we be less worthy or less virtuous than we are now? The answer is no. We would be no less worthy, no less deserving than others. The same is true of those in our society who lack prestigious positions. And so those who grow up in wealthy families, however, do have an unfair advantage over those from less privileged backgrounds. This is no excuse. Life is not fair. It is tempting to believe that government can rectify what nature has spawned, but it is also important to recognize how much we benefit from the very unfairness that we, in fact, deplore. The way things are does not determine the way they ought to be. We should reject the contention that the ordering of institutions is always defective because the distribution of natural talents and the contingencies of social circumstance are unjust, and this injustice must inevitably carry over to human arrangements. Occasionally, this reflection is offered as an excuse for ignoring injustice, as if the refusal to acquiesce in injustice is on par with being unable to accept death. The natural distribution is neither just nor unjust, nor is it unjust that persons are born into society at some particular position. These are simply natural facts. What is just and unjust is the way that institutions deal with these facts. Rawls proposes that we agree to avail ourselves of the accidents of nature and social circumstance, only when doing so is for the common benefit. His theory of justice represents a compelling case for a more equal society.